For those of you that haven't heard, the city had created a task force here in Richmond, and the task force was created to explore the funding of Richmond Police Department and how it's handled and how they can redirect some of the funding to different various programs. And so tonight we have a presentation from Jim Nantell, who oversees the program. He's the liaison to the city and for the task force. So we have a PowerPoint presentation from him, and then after the presentation we have Chief Bisa French, who will talk about the ramifications of these recommendations to the City Council and what they will look like. So if we're ready to start this PowerPoint presentation.
Hi, my name is Jim Nantell, and I've been asked to make a presentation to you to update you on the status of our budget-related recommendations from a public safety task force. My name is Jim Nantell, as I indicated, and I am the lead staff liaison to the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force. We met with the City Council on Monday night, and that was an hour's presentation, so I'm going to try to do this very quickly within the 10 minutes that I've been asked to restrict myself to. Give you some background, the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force presented recommendations to the City Council, and specifically they included both budget recommendations as well as some policy recommendations. The budget recommendations totaled $10.3 million and some proposed new programs. And the recommendation from the task force was to fund these new programs by reducing $10.3 million from the police department's budget. The council directed staff at that May 10 meeting to come back after working with the implementation team of the Reimagining Task Force and come back with a proposal as to how to fund these new programs in the new fiscal year budget. The recommendation by the task force was in 4 areas. One was to expand the youth employment by $1.9 million, so almost $2 million. Expand the Office of Neighborhood Safety by $2.4 million, and to establish 2 new programs. One relative to community crisis response team, and the second one was programs to deal with the homeless and the unhoused in our population in our community. Staff recommended in terms of the first year funding, essentially just under $5.6 million to fund the programs for the first year. $1.9 million for the Youth Works program, $1.6 million for the Office of Neighborhood Safety. And that was because it would take some time to be able to create the new classifications for the positions that were being proposed and to recruit for those. And so it would not take the full $2.4 million in the first year. In terms of the new programs, the Community Crisis Response Team and the Unhoused Intervention programs, the staff has recommended, because of the time that it would take to implement those, that in the first year, the budget would include $1 million to be able to implement each of those. To give you a sense about the specific programs, as I indicated, the recommendation is to add $1.9 million to the Youth Works program in the city. It would allow us to be able to employ up to 500 young adults between the ages of 16 and 24. And that would be compared to the 175 that we've been able to provide work experience to in previous years. The Office of Neighborhood Safety, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it is a non-law enforcement agency. The purpose is to reduce gun violence. They have an existing budget of $1.6 million, and their staff outreaches and works with young adults between the ages of 17 and 21 to be able to work with them to avoid the shootings that have occurred in this population for many years. They've had some real success in being able to reduce that activity in the past. The benefits of the additional funding would allow staff to create a second shift for after 5 or 6 o'clock at night. Currently, the outreach coordinators are working primarily with the Black community in Richmond, the youth that are at risk to being involved in some of these shootings in the past. They do not have the staff currently to be able to outreach and work with the Latinx community. And this would provide additional outreach coordinators to be able to work with that portion of our community. And it would also allow them to spend some time working with older adults in our community. Currently, the efforts have been focused on the ages of 17 to 21, 22. The additional funding would allow us to add 6 outreach coordinators to help with that program. The community crisis response team is a key part of the recommendation relative to the new model that is envisioned by the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force, the new model for providing public safety. This would create a team of 2 mental health and harm reduction specialists and a medic to be able to respond to the mental health calls in the community, both in terms of addressing the domestic violence as well as street conflicts and noise complaints. So it's anticipated that this would be able to significantly reduce the demand on our police officers today. The second program, as I've indicated, there are 3 specific ideas that would be funded to be able to deal with the homeless and the unhoused in our community. There would be a streets team to be able to deal with the issues that police are currently responding to in the community by meeting with and working with those that are involved in the homeless activities that result in complaints and calls to our police department. They would also be able to provide a mobile shower program to be able to allow the unhoused to be able to get the services of a shower and clean up for their daily efforts to be able to find jobs and to be able to gain ongoing employment. The third proposal is relative to adults and family transitional villages. The hope is to be able to provide some locations where we can allow both the unhoused adults, but also the families that may be homeless today, to be able to safely live in a location as we work with that population to be able to transition them into permanent and supportive housing. So obviously the task force has recommended that this be funded by reducing the police department. The recommendation from the task force was that the funding would be achieved by reducing 25 police officers, as well as reducing overtime, special pay, and some operating accounts in order to achieve the $10.3 million. The police chief has indicated that in order to achieve the required savings, that she believes that she would need to cut 35 police officer positions, as opposed to that recommended by the task force, and she would be eliminating some contracts for a value of $1.1 million, getting that total $10.3 million. The best guess at this point is the chief right now has 12 vacancies in the department, and that would save $3 million, could use that money to be available to address this. In order to achieve the first year figure of about $6 million, it's anticipated that she would need to lay off an additional 12 officers in order to provide that funding. In terms of the recommendation from staff for that first year funding of just under $6 million, we propose using $1.6 million from the American Rescue Plan Act. This is federal funding money that would be has become available to the city to be able to address the impacts associated with the pandemic. And we would also be proposing to use another one-time source of funds, which is the projected fund balance for the current fiscal year. There will be some unexpended funding that will be available to carry over into the new year, and the staff is proposing to use $1.3 million of that funding. And then there is some funding for housing in lieu fees and low moderate housing of about $350,000. In order to, again, to achieve the $5.56 million, the police department would need to contribute $2.3 million. The thought from the city manager in relative to using some one-time funding in this first year is it would allow some time to transition the new programs, particularly the ones that we are hoping would reduce the demand for police services. We'd like to transition those into the first year by using some one-time money so that we can demonstrate that, in fact, we would have maybe additional resources we could reduce from the police department in the future. The council was concerned and felt that it was that the staff needed to identify a stable source of funding for the new programs that would be key to move forward. And so consequently, in working with the council at the meeting on Monday night, the council directed staff to work with the task force and to return to the city council with an implementation plan and a budget that would show the city council what it would take to fund the first year costs for all of the 4 programs that have been proposed by the Reimagining task force, and how that could be accomplished within the police department. The council would like to get a clear understanding of what would it really take to do so. The hope is that we could hopefully achieve that without the need to lay off existing staff people. Hopefully we could do it with the 12 vacancies we have today and maybe be able to fund the remaining amount through attrition that would hopefully happen over the next year or so. So the city council will be reviewing the staff's recommendation and follow up on this issue at their budget discussion on the 15th of June. And so if you are interested, you may want to sign in and participate in that discussion with the city council relative to how they finalize their recommendation, direction to staff, I should say, for the balancing the new fiscal year budget. So again, if you have any questions about the information that I've shared, please use my contact information on the screen now. Again, I'm Jim Nantell, so it's jnantell@richmondworks.org. Just drop me an email. I'd be happy to share this full staff report that was presented to the city council if you're interested in that. If you have any specific questions, please follow up and give me an email, and I'll be happy to try to respond to those. Again, my thanks to Ardo for allowing me to present tonight, and I wish you all good luck in the remainder of your meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim Nantell. In response to Jim's PowerPoint presentation, we thought it would be important for the community to understand what the police perspective will be. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Chief French.
Good evening, and thank you, everyone. So I was asked to come here to talk about the effects a $10.3 million reduction to our budget would have. And obviously, it would have a huge effect, losing $10.3 million. But I want to start off by saying that the police department does not object or oppose the recommendations that the task force is making in terms of providing additional services to our community, because we know our community has been underserved for many, many years. I know that for my 23 years of working as a police officer in this town and living here, that we are under-resourced. I see that in responding to calls and seeing people in crisis knowing that they haven't received the services that they need and deserve. So we are in no way in opposition to providing extra more services to our community. I do, though, have some opposition to having the police department fund all these services. I think that there are other funding measures that we should be looking at. I think some of them were talked about in Jim's presentation, and I think that we should continue to explore other funding methods, because the effects to the community a $10.3 million reduction will have, I think, is huge. So first of all, I do have 12 vacancies within the police department right now. That amounts to about $3 million. So that money can be used to immediately fund some of the recommendations the task force is making, but that is going to have an effect still on services that we provide as a police department. Richmond is a difficult place to hire police officers because of our history of being a violent city. People don't want to come here. It's been made even more difficult with the talks of layoffs. I actually have about 18 officers that are in various phases of the hiring process with many other police agencies locally. That means that they are not waiting to see if they're going to have a job July 1 or not. They are choosing to leave on their own. So I already know that I'm going to be fighting an uphill battle in the next couple years just to try to get more police officers hired. So that's my main concern, is that we look at not laying off police officers. But to achieve the $10.3 million, obviously the vacancies can cover the $3 million, but to cover the remainder of the $10.3 million, there's two things that I would need to do. I would need to lay off 23 police officers, and I would also need to cut several contracts that we've had for many years now. I'll start with some of the contracts. First, we have our ShotSpotter contract, and I know ShotSpotter covers some of this area, the Hilltop area, but it doesn't cover all of the local area. But we put ShotSpotter. ShotSpotter is a gun detection system that allows us to know exactly where gunshots are going off at when they're shot. So it directs us and officers to that location immediately. It helps with our response time, makes it quicker, because sometimes people don't call in to the police department when they hear shots fired. They know we have the system. Just last week, we had a homicide, and we received 0 calls of the multiple gunshots fired. We responded later and found somebody shot to death. So that's the importance of that system. Additionally, PAL. PAL is a big one for me because I sit on the board of PAL. The police department used to run PAL all together. Several years ago, probably at least 10 years ago now, PAL became its 501c3 and broke away from the police department, but the police department has continued to subsidize PAL for many years, and to the tune of $300,000 a year. We would no longer be able to provide that subsidy funding to PAL because it equates to more than one police officer position. Some of the other contracts that would be affected are more in-house technical things. One of them is a contract that was recently approved by the City Council, and it's called Police Strategies. It's a way for an outside person to look at all of our uses of force, provide a dashboard for the community, to look at how we use force, when it's used. It's more of a transparency tool. We want to be open and transparent with the incidents that we have that involve force. So those are some of the main ones. There's some smaller contracts that would also be cut. But I think I want to spend the time that I have kind of talking about the effects to the community, the impacts to the community and the services that we're able to provide. So with that many officers cut, we would have to focus pretty much most of our efforts in having a robust patrol teams. And that's because when you call 911, we want to know that somebody's going to respond to that emergency call. So we'll be focused on emergency calls for service. That means, somebody has a gun, somebody has a knife, somebody's, getting physically hurt, somebody's house is actually being broken into at that moment. Those emergency type calls that we want to get to and hopefully, catch a perpetrator in the moment. Other than that, there's not going to be, we won't have the ability to provide a lot of follow-up and investigation after the fact. Our investigations team will be down to probably about a dozen officers, which means that they would have to focus on the shootings and homicides. We had 2 shootings today, and we've had now 7 homicides this year and close to 40 shootings this year. So the 4 homicide detectives that we have obviously have their hands full. So they'll be focused on the more, pertinent emergency calls and investigations that we need them to focus on. Other than that, the other big unit that we need to focus on in investigations is our domestic and sexual violence unit. Domestic violence is huge. We always want to make sure that we're able to charge a suspect in time so they don't get out of jail and go back and re-abuse the victim. So the other focus is on domestic and sexual violence crimes. Property crimes, we would basically only handle if there was somebody in custody, and that just involves taking the case to the district attorney's office for charging. Other than that, we won't have any other units. And so how this affects patrol is, while we'll still have 9 beat officers across the city at any given time, which we do right now, which is not enough, those officers will have to do more of an investigation on the front end, where now, let's say we respond to some type of investigative issue. There's a battery or any kind of investigative issue. The officers that respond take a preliminary report. Those reports then go to our detective bureau for follow-up. And the detectives are able to do follow-up interviews. They go to the, what we call the CIC, the Children's Interview Center, and take children for interviews. Those take hours long. They do, the detectives do more of that the follow-up work that takes a lot longer time to handle. Not having the detectives to do that, patrol officers are going to have to do that on the front end. So that means that there will be longer response times when you call the police. I'll give you another example. Traffic collisions that take a long time to handle. Currently, we have beat officers, if it's a major injury crash, they'll respond to the crash, they'll take the report. They won't take the report. They'll respond to the crash, and then they could call a traffic officer to respond, to do more of the reconstruction, do witness interviews, and take their time to reconstruct the crime scene and complete the report. Without a traffic unit, the patrol officer will have to do that. Those investigations take hours to complete. That means that beat officer will be tied up on that investigation for hours and not be able to respond to the other calls for service on their beats. So those are the things that kind of take place behind the scenes right now that allow for beat officers to be in service more, to take more calls in a timely manner. So the response times are huge. Some of the other impacts are we have to reduce our services. We can't continue to respond to all the calls that we currently respond to. Last year, if some of you guys will remember when I came and spoke about our reduction in services because of the reduction in our staffing last year, in the budget cuts, we lost 34 positions. We had to reduce some of those services that we responded to. And so that included making mandatory reports online. So if your car is broken into in the middle of the night, then instead of calling us to take a report like we've done my entire career, we now refer you, our dispatch center refers you to go online to make that report online, and you don't have any contact with a police officer. To me, that's not customer service. Most people don't call the police, hardly ever. Maybe once, twice. Most people in our community don't call the police all that much, especially up here in this area. But when they do, when you are victimized, you expect an officer to respond. And having to go to that model where we're saying that we're not responding was really difficult for me. But that's where we are in terms of our staffing, where we just don't have enough people to respond to all the calls that we've previously responded to. So to reduce additional calls for service, because again, they're going to be tied up on these longer, investigations, there's additional calls that we are not going to be responding to if these cuts occur. Those are issues with homelessness issues. If they're not criminal issues, if somebody's not being hurt or injured at the time, we're not going to be responding to those issues. Additionally, calls at schools, unless it's an active shooter, we're not going to be responding for many of the other calls at schools. I'm sorry, I got to get my list out for the other stuff. Loud noise and music calls, fireworks calls, calls at our local hospital, trespassing calls at abandoned properties, criminal disturbance, non-criminal disturbances, panhandling and loitering calls, suspicious persons or vehicle calls if it's an anonymous caller and we don't have specific criminal details, drug usage, illegal marijuana grows. So those are some of the things that we're looking at, trying to find alternative responses that don't involve the police department. And some of these can be taken up with the recommendations of the task force once the team gets up and running. But again, that's not up and running right now. So if we have the cuts come July 1, there's going to be a gap in services for people to answer these types of calls. The quality of life issues are also ones that I'm having a difficult time with, and these are drug houses, disorderly conduct, prostitution, again, not necessarily a problem in this area, but in other areas of our city. And these are things that can't be effectively done by police officers when they are responding to calls for service throughout the day. They can't take the time to do the investigation for these longer term problems. A lot of the quality of life issues that we face here in our community take more investigation, take a lot more time to work on to find a resolution. We work with a lot of different community partners as well as other city departments to work on these issues, and the beat officers just don't have the time to do that. But with no other team to facilitate that, those things won't be taken care of. We can't address those issues. So that's pretty much the impacts of what a $10.3 million reduction will look like. My hope is that we can find other ways to fulfill the recommendations of the task force without defunding the police department. Like I said when I started, I think that there are some great recommendations. I think our city needs a lot of services, but I think our city also needs the police department to respond when you call us. And that's what we would like to continue to do. Thank you.